So this is going to be kind of a new format that I'm messing around with. It's essentially me building something relatively small, sped up 2 or 3 times, and I'm just going to narrate the points of interest. So it's somewhere between a speed modeling video and a full-on tutorial. So yeah, I think this might be cool. Let's give it a shot. So why V-Bucks? Well, I was looking at them the other day in the Fortnite store, and I thought it was kind of a cool shape. It's got some interesting challenges with that raised ridge, and the sunken light shapes and that kind of thing. And I thought this is a good candidate for mop booleans and doing a quick little prop video. And before we get going here, the one thing I do want to make absolutely clear is that this video is in no way associated with Epic Games or Fortnite in any official capacity. This is straight up pure fan art. So let's have some fun. Right, so here we go. I've got Moto loaded up. I've got some reference imagery in the background, and we're going to start laying in the basic shapes. With something like this, you want to make sure you start with enough sides on the cylinder. I think that 32 is a good number for this particular shape. Although I do think later on, I kind of regret that and wish I had gone higher. So there really is no good rule there. I think 32, well, 24 to 32 is probably the smallest amount you want to go on something that's very, very round like this. For something larger, more size is almost always better, but it's a balancing act between sides and ease of working on stuff. So here you can see that I've already converted it to a mop boolean. You can see that up in the mesh list there. And now we're going to start to lay out the primitive shapes that we need. The main body, this attractive piece in the middle, and a little later on you'll see me have trouble trying to set up those light subtractives. But like I said, there's a few flubs. I left it in. Have fun watching me screw up. There's a bit of playing here, trying to figure out, like looking at the reference image, looking at the mesh, how big should this hole be, and that kind of stuff. So we're going to inset the outside because we have to get that raised ridge in place. So we make the outer rim, split that with an edge ring, and then pull that edge ring up to create that raised piece. Checking, double checking. I'm always looking at the mesh from different angles, trying to get the specular highlight to move across it and see how things are feeling compared to the reference image. Now this, I believe, is where I make a few attempts at figuring out how to subtract out. Oh no, I'm sorry. This is the V in the middle. This is just the V in the center. We're going to build this and figure out how to best represent that shape, because it really is just a V, with a bevel and then a straight extrude below it. But that initial shape is the first pain in the butt that needs to be done, since it's not just a simple, well, it may be a V from a specific font, but I don't know what that font is, so I just went ahead and kind of eyeballed it. So watching this is equal parts painful and interesting, because I can almost hear my internal monologue that I'm going through, because I'm thinking ahead. I'm like, well, I'm going to have to extrude this, then I'm going to have to bevel it, and I don't want to have any weirdness with with edges that connect up to the corners and that kind of thing. I think, I can't remember exactly what I ended up doing, so we're just going to wait and be surprised. Oh, and trying to find a way to get them to evenly shoot out from the center or from the edges of the V, because just scaling them won't work. Yeah, I think I ended up pushing them, but we'll see here in a second. Right, so I merge it all back into one polygon because that's just easier to do in Modo, and clean up that stray edge. Right, then I hit that with the bevel. Yeah, and then we just massage the shape from here until we get something that looks close enough to the V that we can move on and stop futzing with it. Now this part is basically me hitting the V with sub D. I'm hitting tab, and now I'm having to go through and connect some things up and add some weights to things. But I think I smartly stopped. Well, let's see what I do. There's really no reason to sub D the V, but I think I do anyway for whatever reason. It's just how my brain works sometimes. Yeah, we don't need the bottom polygon. Really, so I don't even know why we're keeping it. But I think I figured that out eventually. Okay, so the V is in place, and now it's a matter of, let's fly around, let's look at it, how big is the V? Is it too big? Is it too small? Is it off center? Lots of futzing. You could probably describe the job of a prop artist as lots of futzing. So when I work with mop booleans, I typically will work directly inside of the stack. There are hotkeys and things I can set up to select components and operators, but I just find it a lot more efficient just to expand the boolean in the mesh item stack. Just select the operators directly. It just works better for me. Your mileage may vary. So you saw me set up the rounded edge material that I wanted on there. I've got it on a little pie menu. We'll talk about that in a future video, but it's been assigned the rounded edge shader, and I usually do a bunch of rendering just so I can see what things look like. Okay, so the video is speeding up to 2 times now, from I think now until the end of the video. But here's where I'm going to edit the piece in the middle that subtracts out that V area, because I wanted to give it a bit of a gutter around the outside. So to do that, I just isolate the mesh within the mop boolean stack, and hit it with a few extrudes, a few insets, a few bevels, and that gives me the result that I want. It's just such a fast and efficient way to work. I can't see ever not working with it now. So this is me starting to figure out how to do those lighting insets. You can almost hear my internal lamentations about the number of sides that I chose to start with. I probably could have used more, to be honest. It would have made this a little faster. I was actually, at the start, I was thinking, well, it'd be much better to have something that's, divisible by 6, because, there's 3 lights and 3 blank areas. But looking at the concept, sorry, not the concept art, the reference image, the lights are not the same size as the blank areas, so that wouldn't have helped. Anyway, so yeah, you're going to see me play around with this for a little bit, and there's a Moto problem here. I'm trying to radial array this, but my Moto does a bit of a barf up where it's trying to auto start the tool with 32 segments or something in it, and when it finally does activate, I end up with some weird state where I can't edit the number of steps. So I'm going to let you enjoy watching that happen, because I do this a few more times, and we're just going to fast forward a little bit. Hold up. Okay, so at this point I've arrived at a solution where I am pretty happy with what's going to happen with the lights. There's too many control edges in here right now, so I'm losing the roundness on the end, but I believe that's what gets addressed next. Kill that edge, kill that. Yeah, actually this is why I don't love sub-D modeling these days. It's just there's so much futzing with it. So I think, so in the end, this is the final solution. I ended up taking the square pieces and rounding off the corners with a bevel, then evening out those edge rings, and then hardening the top and the bottom with edge weights, and that gives me the nice curved precise cutter that I need to accurately represent those lights. So of course at this point we're going to go back to our old friend futzing around, trying to figure out the correct look for things. See, that's looking pretty good, and I like the way it lays on the line in the middle, and I like the way that it shades with the rounded edge shader and all that. So this feels pretty close to what I want it to look like. Now I've copied off the bottom polygons and pasted them into a new mesh item so I can create the actual lights themselves that sit inside the holes. This in the end turned out to not really be necessary, because since the inside is lit up the way it is, there was really no reason to have geometry down there baking into the normal map. But it didn't really hurt anything either. So and it made the high poly look a little more accurate, because when you're looking down you can see the beveling and all that kind of jazz. So you can see here that actually having that geometry down there, it does help get a better render happening, because you get that light edging and that kind of stuff happening. Now what you're going to notice here is that I'm not entirely happy with the crispness of that interior ridge, and that's because the rounded edge shader is smoothing it over like it's supposed to be. So the solution here is to add a slight bevel, give it a couple mitering edges on either side, which will allow it to crisp up and allow me to keep using the rounded edge shader, but you also have a crisper looking edge. So it goes to show sometimes you have to mix and match techniques to get what you want. And now we're going to start to organize the scene, because I need to start working on the low poly soon. So I put all the high poly stuff in its own folder and make up a low poly folder. Now stuff like the V we can just copy pretty much directly and drop it into the low poly folder. I typically will make some sort of a garish material like a bright green or a bright pink or something, so I know which mesh is the low poly when I'm looking at it, so it's like blindingly obvious. And this is a technique that I use quite a bit. I've copied off the Boolean stack from the high poly and pasted it into the low poly. And what that's going to allow me to do is to take those high poly meshes, turn the sub-D off on them, and then use the resulting Boolean of those low poly meshes to create the low poly mesh. It's much faster than me trying to retopo this or whatever. much faster than me trying to retopo this. And it just requires the deletion of a couple of edges, generally speaking. Now looking at this mesh, you can see that my light subtracts were a higher resolution than the mesh that I subtracted from. So there's a bunch of extra edges and things going on here that are going to have to be cleaned up, and you'll see that here shortly. But really that's just a matter of deleting edges that don't matter and welding verts and that kind of thing. And one of the more important parts when you go to clean up a mesh like this, you'll see when you get to the light cavities, is when you go to stitch geometry, you need to preserve the curvature that's there. So welding the verts inside the lights to the existing edges results in better smoothing than the other way around and warping the surface. And yeah, those sides are covered with N-gons, but we clean all that up here shortly with some connecting and merging and that kind of stuff. So I'll just get on with that. Yeah, looking at this now, I can see there's some stuff I've done here that's not exactly as wonderful as I might want it to be on a production prop. But for a tutorial mesh, I was satisfied with how this turned out. So being a little sloppy doesn't really hurt this all that much. You'll see once we get the normal map on there and get a texture and everything, you don't really notice any small sorts of inconsistencies. And right here, we're just kind of simplifying the interior. We could have simplified more. I did select the edge there and kind of hesitated. I was like, maybe we should. But I decided to leave that extra ridge in the middle. It's probably a little wasteful. But that's a judgment call you have to make with every prop. It's, is it worth doing that or is it not worth doing that? So a little extra cleanup, just triangulating some N-gons that I saw sticking around in the end caps. And now we start to UV things. One of those flubs that I mentioned, it occurs in here somewhere because that V got UV mapped, and as I UV things, I tend to UV them and I hide the parts that are already UV just because that's faster for me. And I think I ended up deleting the V and having to recover it again from the high poly mesh, but no biggie. So I'm following the general rule here of wherever there's a smoothing break, I am breaking my UV islands. And since the UV islands are kind of, if I lay them out flat, they'd be kind of long. So I'm trying to UV the caps or the end pieces first, and then the bodies can get done separately. And that doesn't really affect the end bake or anything because they are smooth with each other. So you're allowed to have a UV break where where the transition is smooth already. So here I try a test pack, and it didn't pack very efficiently, and it's because I had those long rectangular islands that had to be a certain size. So it doesn't allow Moto to pack efficiently. Oh, you'll notice here that I've realized that the V is missing, so we're going to have to recover that and copy it back over. But that's good because it gives me a chance to talk a little bit about the UVs. And like I was saying, when you have a long island or a large island, it tends to affect your packing in a negative way because it's trying to maintain the same textile density between everything. So the best way I found to get around that is simply to take those islands, split them in half, try and repack, and just wait till I get to something that I consider to be acceptable. So with the UV map complete, we have to update the smoothing now. Using the Vertex Normal Toolkit, we just smooth it and harden all the UV shells. Simple. Then from here we need to add a morph map, which will be our cage for baking, and just give it a push till it encompasses the high poly. And then I manually lift up the bottom of the lights so they'll cast down straight. It's just kind of a technique I do sometimes. I will manually edit a cage that's being bothersome. So here's our initial test bake. You can see that the rounded edge shader is kind of kicking in there. You can see the outline of the V and all that sort of stuff. So this is working the way I want it to work. We save that out to the disk and then look at it in the viewport. Spin it around, check transitions, make sure that everything looks the way it's supposed to look, and then it's off to Substance Painter. So I pull in my imported normal map, and then I tell Substance Painter to bake the other maps. And it can do that because it has the normal map and it has the low poly. It can use those to approximate the other maps well enough that most of the time that works out fine. It's not the technically most accurate solution, but it does work. And I use it more often than you might think. Yeah, here's another one of those problem flubs. I'm trying to get the color sampled from the reference image, but I cannot get the color picker in Substance Painter to pick up the color I'm pointing at. I don't know what the deal is. So eventually we just start estimating the colors by hand. So the material we create here is very straightforward. It's kind of a glossy plastic, and then I go through and add color tints to various polygon groups and UV shells. And you saw there we've added an emissive channel to the document's outputs, and that's obviously going to be used to generate a mask for the lights. Now I'm giving the lights a color and stuff here just so I can see what it looks like inside the Substance viewport, but ultimately when it gets over to Unreal it's just a black and white mask that I multiply a color against once I'm in there. That just gives you more flexibility, but this is more for sanity checking than anything else. Yeah, and as I said, we have the base plastic, so I'm adding layers on top of that with different tints being multiplied in just to give us the basic look of the VBuck as per the reference image. Now, I don't believe we actually get to see this, but when I export textures from Substance Painter, I'll export a mask texture, which is like a packed texture that has metal roughness and ambient occlusion all packed into the RGB channels. It's just kind of an efficient way to use less textures once I'm inside of Unreal. And once we get done with this, we're going to have to build the collision for this mesh, which is actually pretty easy. I just select the outside ring of polygons, paste that into a new mesh item, delete every second edge because you don't want your collision to be too complicated, and then just kind of take a look at it and verify that it is encompassing the low poly. Scoot, scale, push things around, and then I believe that is it for the collision mesh. So now we pull everything into Unreal because I think we've earned ourselves a little entertainment. This just requires a simple material. You'll see how I set up my textures. There's diffuse, normal, and then I take that packed texture, like I said, and I hook that up where it needs to get hooked up. All very straightforward. And once this gets done, we compile it and go back and look at it. And once we assign it, looks like it should, except we don't have the lights on it, obviously. So we're going to have to set up the emissive, which is just a couple of multiplies to get plugged into the emissive channel. Now, I have a few missteps here with trying to get a four component vector plugged into a 3-component blah blah blah, but I sorted out. Oh yeah, and here I couldn't figure out why I couldn't set the color because I kept clicking on the alpha and not the color setting, but I eventually struggle through this, I promise. And the final fudge you're going to see in here is that I try to set up the physics settings on the coin, but it won't let me choose the physics checkbox because the collision didn't import on the mesh because I spelled it wrong when I was in Unreal, or sorry, when I was in Modo. So I fixed that behind the scenes and just, we move on. Here we go. I think we've got the emissive. There we go. The emissive is set up once I compile the texture. As you can see, we got like a bit of a hazy glow going on in the viewport, so that's all good. It's gigantic in the scene, so we'll scale that down. And there it basically is. Now what I end up doing, like I say, I go and I fix that collision mesh because I can't set this checkbox the way I want it. But once we do that, we're going to make a bunch of these coins. We're going to stack them in the air. We're going to drop them down using physics. And that is going to be the end of our day here. There you go. V-Bucks raining from the sky. So I hope you found that interesting, or at the very least, kind of entertaining. Let me know down in the comments if you want to see more of this type of video, or if you prefer the longer form, the shorter form, or if you like mixing it up. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.